So this is a training for Eastern Pennsylvania Continuum of Care Coordinated Entry Specialists. This is a review of court entry guidance on asking housing history questions during enrollment in PAHMIS. And I'm going to walk through the recent guidance that was issued by email and also switch over to our HMIS training environment to show an example. Really, this is the first part of a Cat 1-4 intake. The universal data assessment is required, meaning the questions themselves and the way they are framed and defined is defined by HUD through their HMIS data standards document. And the for core entry specialists, this screen should be very familiar, the universal data assessment screen. And these are the questions. They do tend to cascade, meaning depending on how you select an answer to a prior question may affect what you see next in the screen. So we're going to walk through all five of these questions and just talk through exactly what we're asking. I think for those of you that are doing this day to day, you know that sometimes you're going to have to ask some follow-up questions or clarify what it is you're asking because our language, even though we make every attempt to take the jargon out of it, some of it is still related to the HUD definitions and we have to use some of the jargon. So we've the core entry operations work group, which includes our regional managers, our 211 leads, our core entry committee chair, and myself reviewed all this together. Also solicited input from our HMIS team at PADCED as well as our HMIS vendor Caseworthy. So together we believe these are the right ways to ask the question and to record instructions on how to record the appropriate answer. So, starting with the first question, prior living situation, we're really asking where did you sleep last night? If you are if you have a slightly different way of asking that question, if there are words that you're more comfortable with that you find are more helpful for people you're talking to, that's okay. But really, this is meant to be a script because it's ideal if we're all asking the same questions the same way. Prior living situation is the goal of this question is to identify where the head of household slept the previous evening before enrollment. And as we know, it's not about where they think they will be sleeping tonight or what their living situation will be tonight. It's about last night. That is one of the HUD requirements that sometimes can cause some tension, but we do need to know where they slept last night so that we understand whether they're eligible for Category 1 and for housing programs. So when you ask that question, the answer choices typically is, and hopefully Leanna will let me know if you can't see, I switched over to our training environment. Under homeless situations, typically you're selecting place not meant for habitation, which does include this on the street, quote unquote, but that is shorthand for any abandoned building, uh, outdoor space, or other place that doesn't have the amenities that are considered part of a habitable living environment. We have a separate training on Category 1 in our training video series that talks in more detail about what those other situations might be. But together they are a place not meant for habitation. So whatever answer you receive from the head of household, if it fits that place not meant for habitation, that's what you would select. An emergency shelter, including hotel or motel, paid for with a voucher. If someone is paying 50% or 51% or the majority of their own dollars on hotel or motel, they would not qualify for Category 1. But if it is a public agency, a nonprofit, a faith organization that's paying for the majority of the hotel stay, that would be considered emergency shelter stay. And finally, a safe haven. I I believe it's still accurate to say we don't technically have any safe havens in the CoC, but there are communities in the Commonwealth and nationally that have a variant, a kind of a variation of shelter that's a safe haven. So, unless you're talking with someone who's currently out of our CoC and in a safe haven in another CoC, you're probably going to be selecting this place or emergency shelter for all Cat 1 enrollments, unless the person is in an institutional situation or in a temporary situation like transitional housing. So, whatever is the most accurate is what you will select, and that will help us determine whether the head of household is going to continue to be eligible for our Cat 1-4 enrollment. The second question then is length of stay in that living situation. So we're looking for the most accurate or even an estimated answer to when did you begin living in this situation? And so the answer is you might again have to just help them think through a little bit when that approximate date of their current living situation started. And as always, you would select whatever the appropriate answer is here. I do want to note that for coordinated entry intake, as a reminder, when we talk about prior living situation and later in our workflow, we talk about current living situation, for court entry, that's the same thing. So 99.99% of the time, prior living situation and current living situation for us means where they slept last night. So we would select length of stay in prior living situation, and then what we kind of the reason we came together for a dedicated training on housing history is to make sure that we're all answering the next question the same way. And that question is, what is the approximate date this episode of homelessness started? So our script-based question is, when was the last time you lived in a house or apartment, even if it was with family or friends, because we're trying to figure out, as you see in the instructions that follow, that what we're really trying to do is weave together all of the category one homeless situations that are consecutive. So it's one thing if someone was in shelter last night and they've been in shelter for 5 nights, but when we get to approximate date this episode started, episode refers to any category one living situation that is not broken up by a 90-day or longer stay in an institution or a 7 night or more stay in a permanent housing situation. So if you're helping someone figure out when their episode started, you do want to calculate every consecutive homeless situation, um, whether it's place not meant for habitation or emergency shelter, or if they went from emergency shelter to place not meant for habitation and into another emergency shelter or back into your emergency shelter, and there was not a break in homelessness that was over 7 nights in permanent housing or over 90 days in an institution, you would then help them add all those together to arrive at the approximate date this episode of homelessness started. I completely, we understand that that is a very difficult thing to do, but the more accurately we can identify the answer to this question, the more we can make sure that the household is prioritized appropriately for whatever housing and services we can provide them. So that is really what approximate date of homelessness episode started means. The phrase this episode refers to all of those category one situations that don't have that break. That cascades then into the fourth question. How many times have you been homeless in the past 3 years, including today? And then we do have an explainer, and we think it's important to have a little bit more information to help them answer this question, because again, we are trying to calculate the number of episodes, and the number of episodes is different from the number of individual homeless situation experiences. One thing we see in the data, we have to submit our core entry data every year to HUD in a special report. And when we run that report before we submit it to HUD, um, the HUD system identifies errors. One of the errors that we commonly see and that we'd like to correct is when someone says, "Well, I've been in shelter, or I've been on the street, or I've been in an encampment for since really for 3 to 5 years." Let's say, and so the approximate date this episode of homelessness started is something like 2019 or 2017 or 2023, and it's definitely more than 3 years. It does tie into this question because the question is saying, regardless of where you stayed last night, how many times have you been in this situation? Meaning, how many episodes have you had in the past 3 years? If we're going back and counting wrong, like someone says, well, in the last 5 years, I've been in shelter 4 times, and we're counting those as four separate episodes, which would be the wrong way to do it. If we have a date here that says 2017, and then we have and then we have something that says, well, they've been homeless, they've experienced homelessness 4 more times since 2017. This creates the error because what approximate date episode started means if they've been consecutively in a Cat 1 situation without a defined break for 5 years, that means they have been in that episode of homelessness for 5 years, and it's one episode. And then the final question is total number of months homeless on the street, in emergency shelter, or in a safe haven. And we would ask that how many months have you been homeless on the streets, in emergency shelters, or in safe havens in the past 3 years, including this month? It feels like we've already asked these questions. Why are we specifically having to ask them now to recalculate that in terms of total number of months? The answer simply is that it's part of the HUD equation for whether someone meets the chronic homelessness definition. So again, when we're talking about this question, note that the instructions are record the total number of months the client has experienced homelessness on the streets, in shelters, or in safe haven for the past 3 years. And again, as a reminder, it's not just about where they slept last night in question one and how long they were there, but it's really about these episodes of homelessness. And as a final note, if a person experiences homelessness for even one day in a month, that month counts in terms of how many months in the last 3 years they have experienced homelessness. So, taken together, these are the questions that help us move to the next stage of the enrollment, make sure someone is actually going to be eligible for a Category 1 enrollment, and also determine what their length of time homeless is, which is part of our by name list prioritization in addition to the HAT score and other elements. And it also, these answers determine whether or not a household would meet the chronic homeless definition.